So I was saying to André that there was a certain folly in my agreeing to come and talk with you about Zeno's Conscience, or as I first read it, Confessions of Zeno.
That's right.
Yeah, La Coscienza di Zeno, but I don't speak Italian. In part because, I read it first when I was at university, and I went around for, easily 10 or 15 years afterwards, when people would say, what's your favorite book? I would say, it's Italo Svevo's Confessions of Zeno. And they would say, what's it about? And I would say, it's about a man who is trying to quit smoking. And they would say, well, what happens in it? And then there came a point where I realized I couldn't remember. So I was going around telling everybody it was my favorite book, but I really, aside from the fact that he was trying to quit smoking, and certain great lines, my brow was usurping my head, the idea that he comes up with for a little high chair on a tram. Do you remember that bit? For his daughter Antonia is crying a lot, and he comes up with the idea of an electric switch that would send her on a trolley to the furthest point in the house so that her cries would actually be quite pleasant to hear. So there were certain things that I remembered, but not really what happened. And so about in 2002, I think, William Weaver did a new translation, which I think is now the one that people generally read, which is Zeno's Conscience. And I read it again, and I wrote about it, and I loved it just as much as I had when I was younger. And so when André said, pick a book that you like, I said, my favorite book, one of my favorite books is Zeno's Conscience. And then I realized that I didn't remember what happened, except that it was a book about a man who was trying to quit smoking. And so I sat down and recently reread it all over again. And if you have a memory like mine, it's fairly new every time, which is sort of great, and seems in a way slightly Zeno-ish somehow. The patterns, I delight over the same things as if they were new, even though once I knew them off by heart. But I thought I might just say a little bit first about why the book is meaningful to me. And I think there are a number of reasons. Did you read the introduction, or did you get a sense of his biography? A little bit. So he was born in 1861. André knew his birth date exactly for important personal reasons. It overlaps with important dates in André's life. December 19th.
My marriage, okay?
December 19th, 1861, and he.
No.
Not that part. The December 19th part.
I have endurance, okay?
And he died in a car accident, or as the result of a car accident in 1928. I think that one of the reasons that he, when I was young and an aspiring writer, one of the reasons that he seemed meaningful to me, quite aside from the text of this novel itself, was the writerly struggle that he had, which is to say, he was born into a bourgeois family with every expectation, I think, of having some freedoms. They were 8 surviving children of 16 children born, but they were a large family, and his father was quite successful, and then his father lost all his money, and Ettore Schmitz, because Italo Svevo, of course, is a pen name, had to go to work, and he went to work in a bank, and he worked in a bank for most of his adult life, but he didn't give up writing. His younger brother Elio believed enormously in him as a writer, and set him deadlines, which he repeatedly failed to meet. Unsurprisingly, he bore more than a passing resemblance to his character. He also failed to quit smoking many, many, many times, and indeed had a not a bet, but a promise. I guess it was a bet with his then fiancée, Livia, who became his wife, that if he could stop smoking for 3 months, she would kiss him. And so he told her that he had stopped smoking, and 3 months later they had their first kiss, and then he revealed that in fact he'd secretly been smoking all along, and his brothers and sisters had been helping him in his lie. But I digress, which I do a lot. But he wrote his first book, Senilità, Una Vita, A Life, and couldn't find a publisher for it, and published it himself in 1892. His second book, Senilità, which is translated as Emilio's Carnival, he published in 1898, also at his own expense. He had few reviews and negative ones. The book sank like a stone, and at that point he renounced and said, well, I will not publish. And for 24 years he didn't publish anything. And so I think when I was young, it sounds perverse perhaps to say that gave me hope, but it gave me hope that 24 years later he did. He published Confessions of Zeno, or Zeno's Conscience, and became the toast of Europe. And of course, then in a very Zeno Cosini sort of way, was killed in a car accident only 4 years later. So he didn't have a long time to enjoy it. But he did. But that in itself, I mean, his sort of life's trajectory has about it the dark, absurd comedy of his fiction. He was a great fan of Schopenhauer, and which also seems appropriate. I don't know if you know the lovely fact about Schopenhauer, who had a similar trajectory actually, and wrote The World as Will in 1818, I think, published it in 1818. No reviews, no attention, nothing. But Schopenhauer, unlike Svevo, had indomitable confidence and was quite sure that people would come round. He didn't change a thing. He didn't change his routines, nothing. He just kept going. And year after year, year after year, year after year, and then people turned around and paid attention to The World as Will in 1855. So he had a pretty long wait. And one of the things that I've always wondered all my life is if you were a neighbor of Schopenhauer's in between 1818 and 1855, did you go around saying, there's a brilliant philosopher at the end of my street who nobody has paid any attention to, or did you go around saying, there's a crazy guy at the end of the street who thinks he's a philosopher? And indeed, I think it's a sort of there's a kind of a posse of often comic but primarily pessimistic writers, where there's a certain where this sort of theme or similar themes recur, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Thomas Bernhardt's Wittgenstein's Nephew, but in Wittgenstein's Nephew, of course, he says of the main character who is his good friend, who is in fact Wittgenstein's nephew, he says, Ludwig Wittgenstein was a great philosopher on paper. My friend was a great philosopher in his head. He just didn't put it all on paper. And you'll recall there's the character in here when he's trying to quit smoking, of whom Svevo says a similar thing, that he's somebody whose brilliance is in his mind, but he doesn't write it down. And I think all of the writerly questions about what it means, or artistic questions about what it means to be an artist, which actually I was sort of trying in my own little way to address in my last novel. Are you an artist? Are you an artist if if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there, does it make a sound? Are you an artist? Are you a philosopher if you don't write it down? Are you a philosopher if you write it down and nobody reads it? Are you an artist are you a writer if you are Italo Svevo and for 24 years you're writing but you don't show it to anybody? That sort of personal narrative was compelling to me. Of course, I've left out the star turn thus far, which is of course the importance of James Joyce in his life and in the discovery of his work. As you may recall, James Joyce taught him English, and the reason James Joyce taught him English is because he worked for his wife's ship paint company, a company that made paint for ships. And as part of his work, he had to spend a certain amount of time in England, and his English was very poor. And James Joyce came to Trieste, where he lived, and was teaching, I believe, at the Berlitz School. And they became friends that way. And he showed Joyce his first two novels. And Joyce compared him to Anatole France, and said he was a very fine writer. And many years later, even though they hadn't really stayed in touch, when Confessions of Zeno came out, again the publication paid for by Svevo, and it got no reviews. At that point, he sent it to Joyce and said, "Can you help me?" And Joyce sent it to Valérie Larbaud and Benjamin Crémieux in Paris, who introduced it to the world, and that's how come the book's in print, because without them it wouldn't be. And I think that ties to another, and then I will move on to talk about the book. I'm not just going to talk about his biography, but another part, I think, of what was always appealing to me about him has always been is I've never been to Trieste. Has it? You must know.
No,
Has
never.
anyone been to Trieste? Well, Trieste is a sort of liminal spot, right? And it is in a part of Italy that has been at various times part of Austria, and it is a sort of mercantile. It's a merchant port city that has a unique culture that isn't wholly Italian. It has a dialect that is different from Tuscan Italian. His pen name, Italo Svevo, means the Italian Swabian, right? And his mother was of Italian Jewish extraction, and his father of Austrian Jewish extraction. So he sort of embodied this dichotomy, but he was part of, and I think his whole family, they were all irredentist Italians, which means they were great Italian patriots who wanted to ensure that Trieste remained Italian. So this strange fact of living on the edge of a country to which he wanted passionately to belong, but that didn't necessarily feel the same about, that didn't give much of a hoot about Trieste generally, I think, and also specifically was snobbish about Trieste. So one of the complaints that comes up repeatedly about his work is that it is written in clunky and ugly and ugly Italian. I mean, I think in especially as English is of course, we did luck out. We did luck out with English. It has the biggest vocabulary. It is the most sort of elastic and mutable of languages. I always like to recall that Shakespeare used a vocabulary of 24,000 words, and Racine at the same time, in writing in French, a vocabulary of 8,000 words. So I think it's hard for us to have a sense of the preciousness or the pride, in a way, that certain languages have about. I mean, in French, there's, you know, the French will say of someone, il écrit un très bon français, right? Il parle un très bon français, right? The idea that you would say of someone, she speaks a very good English. This is not really, it's not, and the point about Svevo is that he didn't speak a very good English. I mean, a very good Italian. He spoke dialect. And in fact, I wanted just to start in a way as an opening point of how I think I read the book, or one of the ways I read the book, and there are lots of ways to read the book. There are lots of things the book is about, and I hope we'll talk about a lot of them, or many of them. But one I think that is really central for me is in a way sort of encapsulated in the last section, psychoanalysis, on page 404 of the version that I have, which is the vintage version. The doctor puts too much faith also, this is the doctor being the psychoanalyst, in those damned confessions of mine, which he won't return to me so I can revise them. Good heavens, he studied only medicine, and therefore doesn't know what it means to write in Italian for those of us who speak the dialect and can't write it. A confession in writing is always a lie. With our every Tuscan word, we lie. If he knew how, by predilection, we recount all the things for which we have the words at hand, and how we avoid those things that would oblige us to turn to the dictionary. This is exactly how we choose from our life the episodes to underline. Obviously, our life would have an entirely different aspect if it were told in dialect. And while this is obviously in some way a comic turn of one of so many, the doctor won't return the confessions so that Zeno can revise them. The point surely being that your psychoanalytic outpourings it's very important that they not be revised, and in analysis it's in the very words that we choose to tell our stories are seen as significant. In this case, he's making a joke about the revision of stories. You'll recall that when he goes first to the Malfenti household, and he tells the four sisters the stories about his life, and they don't believe him, and he says, well, they were told in the only way I could tell them at that point. I told them to so many women before that they got sort of changed along the way, you know. So in that sense, I think what this novel is for me a novel about storytelling, and how we create meaning, and how we we use certain templates or filters of various kinds through which to order our experiences and our thoughts, and one of them is a sort of baseline one is language. We don't have, without language, obviously there's music, or there are the visual arts, but essentially in our day-to-day lives, without language, we don't have a mode of communication, and yet the distortions that a given language might require of us will change the story and change, in that sense, also ourselves and our relationships. Other, as it were, filters. In a way, the novel is set up in a series of filters. So, and the filters, sort of taken, if you will, from psychoanalysis, are filters of are sites of desire, right? So there's the what seems almost purely comic cigarette filter, which opens the book, and then there's the family. So his father's death. Then there's marriage, courtship, right? Courtship, a sort of desire for domestic family life. Then there's sexual desire, which if you think of the difference between Ada and Carla, Ada is idealized, and indeed, I don't know about you, but I wish I could actually see a photo of her, because I'm not sure how perfect she would actually be. And then sexual desire, and then money, right? The long section about business, and in that way, the story is the reason I couldn't remember what happened in the book is because in some way nothing really happens in the book except life, the small ins and outs. I mean, the on every page there's a moment or an exchange or a series of exchanges that involve deception and honesty, that involve telling and not telling, that involve exaggeration and or denial. But in the broad arc, you'll recall that he says the big things happen just in passing. So summer came around and Giovanni died, and my daughter Antonia was born. Those are two sentences in one paragraph, in the middle of talking about his mistress Carla. It isn't, but they're organizing principles. He's divided this up in sort of to tell a story through the language of the bourse, of the business trade, or the language of courtship, or the language of vice, of his smoking. And then the other thing that seems to me importantly related to that is that how then do you make meaning, right? If you're organizing things by stories, what gives a story its meaning? The end, right? Until you have the end, you don't have the satisfaction of understanding the story. So how do you make an ending? You resolve that it will end. So if you have your last cigarette, it's a much more meaningful cigarette than just a regular old cigarette, because it marks the end, or possibly the beginning of something. And indeed, with your love affair, if you sleep with your mistress for the last time, that's really a lot more meaningful than just, sleeping with her, yet another time. But what you don't want is for that really to be the last time. And that sort of leads me to another sort of, for me, central aspect of the book, which is that that it's a book about illness, right? He is a malade imaginaire. He's a guy with more aches and pains than but he doesn't really want to be cured. He in fact, what the war teaches him is that if you're not sick, you're dead. So sickness suddenly looks, and you'll remember that the at the end he says, he has the wonderful line about psychoanalysis: the best proof that I never had that sickness, meaning the Oedipal complex, is supplied by the fact that I'm not cured of it. So the fantasy of illness, which has served him all along, there are things he can do and can't do, he's licensed to do or prevented from doing because of his aches and pains. He realizes that they're as much invented by his consciousness as was, say, the perfection of Ada. Or he sets Giovanni up as his opposite, right? I mean, in a sort of Dostoevskian way. He is, Zeno is the Notes from Underground guy, and he's the man of thought, and Giovanni, his second father, is the man of action, right? And says, his brutish ignorance brought him peace, I think is the actual a line quite like that. But we know also that that Giovanni was unfaithful to his wife. We know that Giovanni also, I mean, there's a wonderful sort of quasi-Marxist moment when Zeno can't understand that everybody else seems to think the stock market is a perfectly okay business to get into when it just seems like gambling. But they all say, well, our dad did it. It's totally fine to do it. I mean, he does manage to make the markets work to his advantage. Then again, at the end, after Guido's death, he manages to make another killing somewhat more consciously, that reduces, from the entire fortune being lost, he manages to get half of it. I think one of the things that that for me is powerful about this book. Look, as a writer, for me, I love language. I love all sorts of aspects of narrative, but for me, it's ultimately the people, right? I think that ultimately the human experience, an illumination of the human experience, is what is most meaningful to me as a reader. It reminds me of the sort of malade imaginaire front, where late in the book, again towards the end, he goes to Dr. Pauli and gets diagnosed with diabetes briefly. And he says, I loved my illness. It was so sweet to me. The whole question, again, having said earlier about who's an artist, who's not an artist, who's sick and who's not sick. So there's that long debate with Copper, I think it is, about is the malade imaginaire as much a sick person as the person with incurable nephritis? And he's only satisfied when they come to the conclusion that they're both equally sick. Even though, of course, Copper dies and he doesn't. And it's also, worth inserting that his beloved younger brother died of nephritis. So the echo there has to have been a deliberate. What is that? What is that note? It's not melancholy because it's also laughing, but tragicomic. It's a tragicomic note. If we look for a minute at that section about his father's death, it's funny to me because when I first read it, I had never seen anybody die or dying. And I think when I read it again, I had never seen anybody die. And when I read it this time, I have watched my parents die. And I think the human truth of the description is incredibly, it's both funny and ghastly and incredibly true. So on my version, page 55, one evening, Carlo, the orderly, summoned me to observe some new progress in my father. I rushed after him, my heart pounding at the idea that the old man might become conscious of his illness and reproach me for it. It comes up again with Giovanni, where I think it's Coppola says, a man is dying and doesn't know it, right? And in terms of Zeno, part of his so-called strength is precisely his neurosis, his self-awareness, that nothing will come upon him unawares, and so in that sense he's in a stronger, even if he's sick, he's in a stronger position because it won't, it's like I used to always stay awake on the airplane, always stay awake and just in case, and then my husband said, so you want to be the first to know we're going down? Like, what is there some advantage to that? But it is a version. I mean, you can see that as a type of strength. But my father was on his feet in the middle of the room, dressed only in his underwear. When I came in, he said to Carlo, open. He wanted the window open. Carlo replied that he couldn't do it because of the great cold, and for a while my father forgot his own demand. He went and sat down in an armchair by the window and stretched out, seeking relief. When he saw me, he smiled and asked, did you sleep? I don't believe my reply reached him. This wasn't the consciousness I had feared so long. When a man dies, he has too many other worries to allow any thinking about death, which of course reads as a very comic line, but is also true. My father's whole organism was concentrated on respiration, and instead of listening to me, he shouted again at Carlo, open. He could find no rest. He left the chair in order to stand up, and so on and so on. That day, moving from bed to chair, he stopped at the mirror and, gazing at himself in it, murmured, I look like a Mexican. I think it was I think it was to escape the ghastly monotony of the race from bed to chair that on this day he attempted to smoke. For me, reading this time, I remembered a time, and it was actually my father's penultimate illness, but he was delirious in hospital, and he suddenly sat up, and I guess he was being transferred from one room to another, and we were in a hallway, and he was on a gurney, and he was absolutely not compos mentis. And he looked up, and he said to my sister and me, who were standing beside him, he said, "I know what this is. This is a fiesta." He did this little gesture, like, this is a fiesta. And it was, you know, it was a little bit like sort of Captain Haddock in when drunk, you know, but it was also this this realization that whatever he was experiencing, it was absolutely real and totally intense. It was like a dream indeed. He was in it, and we were there with him, but we couldn't cross into the world that he was in, and that indeed at that time he then my dad made a miraculous recovery at that point, more information than you need to know, but it was nice that he did. But he did not for a second think of death. It did not. I mean, in that sense, we should all be reassured, really, that we will be like Zeno's father and like Giovanni, that in the moment. In the lead up to our death, we're sort of unlikely to think that we're dying, and in that sense, not to go on about it at great length, but I think that the malady of the century, if you will, is this self-awareness, but it is also the strength that he has. It's the thing that none of the other men seem fully to have. Guido doesn't seem to have it. Giovanni definitely doesn't have it, and his father perhaps doesn't have it. But his sickness is willed. It reminds me again of Notes from Underground. It was an argument against utilitarianism, and saying actually humans are perverse. We will do things that are not in our own. Enlightened self-interest does not trump all. We do things that are very and if you think of that sort of precept, just starting with the smoking, right? You don't the reason to quit smoking is because it will kill you, right? So the fact that you don't quit smoking is a perverse act, and he's written in his dictionary at the letter C. Last infidelity, even though at that point their relationship is unconsummated. So the fantasy of his sin or of his transgression, the fantasy of his transgression is so thrilling that he can't wait to get there, even as it repels, even as it makes him feel sullied and filthy. That's why I say it's about storytelling. Any of our stories, we shape them in some mimetic way, in the form or in response to the forms of stories that we have heard or encountered before, right? So our idea of the shape of a story is already, it's one of the things I worry so much about. Like if you think, like, I saw Star Wars once in a cinema, and my 12-year-old son has seen it like 3,000 times on DVD. So his idea of the shape of a story is different than mine. Again, I come back to the human truth of it for me, that it is in that sense exaggerated or condensing of many instances into a sort of 500-page book, but 400-page book. But I think to me I feel that now I tread on, having told you about my father's illness, now I'll tell you about my, so I married a liar who has always the best intentions and indeed likes people to be happy, rather like Zeno. And there just came a point where I said, you got to leave me out of it. But early on, I mean, there are many stories of his lives. Like when we met in England, and I was studying at Cambridge, and he was too, and then he was in London, I missed the train to get back for tutorial, and he called up and said that I missed the train because my mother was visiting London and had been running for a bus and had broken her collarbone, which wasn't true. But the professor was, of course, then very sympathetic, and when I went, I talked a lot about what had happened when he'd broken his own collarbone. So. But on the telling a story just to just to make somebody happy, it wasn't about war, so it wasn't going to cause. But he didn't. When we were younger, if we were invited to dinner parties on the same night, he didn't like to disappoint somebody, so he would just say yes, even if he knew 3 weeks or a month before that we weren't going to be able to go. And then sometimes he would remember to get out of it, and then other times he wouldn't. And there was a time when we were supposed to go to a dinner party, and I suddenly realized we were also supposed to go to another dinner party at the same time. And so I said, you got to do something about that. So he called up this chap, and he said, well, I'm afraid we can't come because Claire has appendicitis, and we're
She went dead.
and we're rushing. But this is one of the things afterwards. I said, you can't include me in the lies anymore. He said, she has appendicitis, and we have to rush to the hospital. And then we went to the other dinner party and promptly forgot, as one does. And so, 3 months later, we run into Francis, the guy who had the dinner party, and he looks at me and says, "Gosh, Claire, I hope you're okay." And I don't, of course, it wasn't my lie. I don't remember. I don't know what he's talking about. My husband did not miss a moment, did not miss a beat. Stepped right in. And he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "We got to the hospital, and it turned out it was just trapped wind." So, anyway. So maybe you could say I'm married to Zeno Cassini, but the sort of human truth of you come up with the thing that will solve the problem in the moment, never anticipating that it will generate another problem that will then need to be solved. Like he doesn't want to be at the wedding. He takes offense at Signor Franceschi and Giovanni's Giovanni when before the wedding dinner of Guido and Ada, and then he has to go. He has to make himself feel better. He has to go see Carla, but his excuse is that he's going to see Copper. Do you remember? Yeah. And then he goes back after seeing Carla and discovers that Copper has kicked the bucket while he was off with his girlfriend, and then he ruins the wedding dinner because he's trying to justify the fact that he was at Copper by saying, but he died, but nobody wants to hear at the wedding feast that the guy died. So then he says, he didn't die. So then the only thing he can think of to do is get really, really drunk. So, which also seems humanly true, right? I mean, there's some way in which it is absurd, but it is also only a slight exaggeration of what plausibly could happen. I have a friend who told me 10 years after my wedding that the reason she missed my wedding and showed up afterwards was because she had had a tryst with her secret lover, and they were in bed and she'd lost track of the time. So it's not very different from. It's not very different. I don't know. I'm thinking we should look at a couple of passages. I do want to look at the end, but I think we should look at the end because I would happily talk about Guido's funeral. Well, Guido's death entirely, in fact. When we come to the actual suicide, what is it? Why does Guido do it then? I mean, I wonder if it isn't a version of Zeno's own state of mind, which is wanting sickness, right? But don't you ever have the moment where there's something you really don't want to do, and you think, well, if I was just hit by a car right now, then I'd be in hospital, and then I wouldn't have to do it, right? Then everybody would feel sorry for me, and I wouldn't have to do it, right? And it seems potentially as you are because then on page 385, as long as he was alive, I saw him in a certain light, which was the light of a part of my days. With his dying, that light was transformed as if it had suddenly passed through a prism, and it was this that dazzled me. He had erred, but I immediately saw that as he was dead, nothing of his error remained. According to me, he was an imbecile, that clown who in a cemetery paved with laudatory epitaphs asked where they bury the sinners around there. The dead are never sinners. Guido now was pure. Death had purified him. The ending of the story is, if you get to the ending's always gives meaning to the rest. But he didn't actually want to. I don't think Guido wanted to get to the. I mean, we understand that he only took the regular Veronal, and he could have been saved, so he didn't want to get to the ending. I feel as though there's some part of the comedy is a cultural indulgence of venality, if you will, right? Everybody's going to try and make their lives easier or better in the ways that they can. So there is some playing on sort of human stereotypes, but also the stereotypes of the culture. But I guess one of the things I'm curious about is is Guido as a figure. His end is sort of preposterous and silly, and he does seem to be a crappy businessman. I think we can say that. But Zeno has a complicated emotion about him, doesn't he? He likes him, but there's also. Do you remember when he plays the violin? Yeah. Not when it starts to annoy his wife and all, but at the beginning, when he says it was the moment of like seeing Michelangelo's marble being hewn, that it was the moment of ecstasy. That music has never given me such a moment. Again, and this is I feel like this comedy with Nalini heading to Nalini, whom he actually hates, but Nalini thinks he's Zeno's best friend, but he doesn't like him. But they're on their way to the funeral together. This is page 388, 389. So we left the office at 389, and began to run because we remembered that the funeral was to take place at 2:45. So they jump into a cab and order the driver to follow the funeral, and it's pure slapstick at this point, right? It's like Laurel and Hardy or something. And then if you go to the top of 392, that day the weather had turned fine again. A splendid spring sun was shining, and in the still-soaked countryside the air was clear and healthy. My lungs, taking the exercise I hadn't allowed myself for several days, swelled. I was all health and strength. Health is evident only through comparison, and that's why the line later, I wasn't comparatively healthy, I was really healthy. I compared myself to poor Guido, and I climbed higher and higher with my victory in the very struggle where he had fallen. All was health and strength around me. The country, too, with its young grass, the long and abundant watering, the other day's catastrophe, now produced only beneficent effects. And the luminous sun was the warmth desired by the still frozen earth. Surely the more we moved away from the catastrophe, the more disagreeable that blue sky would be, unless it could darken in time. But this was the forecast of experience, and I didn't remember it. It grips me now only as I write. Only now as I write. At that moment there was in my spirit only a hymn to my health and all of nature's undying health. Health is evident only through comparison. So precisely the sort of death of Guido is the rise of Zeno. But then the long and abundant watering, the rain, right? The other day's catastrophe now produced only beneficent effects. And the luminous sun was the warmth desired by the still frozen earth. Surely the more we moved away from the catastrophe, the more disagreeable that blue sky would be, unless it could darken in time. So it's literally a weather comment on the one hand, right? It's literally saying the further we get from the rain, the more a problem the blue sky becomes. The long and abundant watering, comma, the other day's catastrophe, comma, so it's in apposition. The other day's catastrophe, one can read as the long and abundant. The catastrophe is the watering, right? But there is also the ambivalence or the possibility that the other day's catastrophe is not the watering, but the death. Then it becomes an issue of translation to...
The verb is thou, so the catastrophe is the bagnatura
Is the water.
Because it's in singular. If it were two separate things, it would be a plural.
Okay, because in English you can't
Exactly.
tell.
In English it's gave.
Yeah, you can't
It
tell.
gave, they gave.
Okay.
In Italian it's a singular.
Okay, so it is. So it isn't the death. So the death is not remotely on his mind then, which in itself is quite interesting. In the same way that when he's visited Coppola and goes to Carla, he starts telling stories, but as if Coppola were dying or making fun in some way, and then he realizes, I shouldn't be joking about Coppola dying, when I'm with Carla. So there's a, and again, I feel as though we can analyze the psychoanalytic reasons for things, but it's also a human truth, right? It's actually also just what it's like. When my father was dying, when he was dying the first time and didn't die, the time of the fiesta, it was spring and the cherry blossoms were all out, and you'd leave the hospital and you'd go and walk the dog, and you'd walk the dog in sort of alleys of cherry blossoms, and after a few minutes you couldn't quite remember that just back in the hospital was this sort of strange dissolution of time, those 24-hour days where 5 hours go by and nothing, you don't really tell. You moved into another world and they were sort of separate and simultaneous. And that, it seems, is actually the one of life's many. I mean, don't you have the experience of when it's like when you get off a plane and you think, oh my God, I was in London this morning, and London's still there and it's still going on, and I'm here and this is different, but that happens with life and death. So it isn't untrue to forget. And does it make him? Does it make him a bad guy? But yes, we also. I feel like it doesn't, but we also want to think he is. Well, then maybe let's have a look just at the very end, because one of the things, of course, that I wanted to ask right at the beginning is, does this seem like a novel of 100 years ago, or does it seem like a novel of now? I mean, for me, there are things that I read that I love, but that seem far away, that seem as though, I love reading Henry James, and Henry James is amazing, and there's much human truth in Henry James, but I'm always aware that Henry James is not now. I do know a guy who's like somebody out of Edith Wharton, but basically it seems like another time. But with this novel, I feel as though it seems immensely contemporary, and we could just maybe look at that last page starting at present-day life is polluted at the roots. Present-day life is polluted at the roots. Man has put himself in the place of trees and animals and has polluted the air, has blocked free space. Worse can happen. The sad and active animal could discover other forces and press them into his service. There is a threat of this kind in the air. It will be followed by a great gain in the number of humans. Every square meter will be occupied by a man who will cure us of the lack of air and of space. Merely thinking of it, I am suffocated. But it isn't this, not only this. Any effort to give us health is vain. It can belong only to the animal who knows a sole progress, that of his own organism. When the swallow realized that for her no other life was possible except migration, she strengthened the muscle that moves her wings, and it then became the most substantial part of her organism. The mole buried herself, and her whole body adapted to her need. The horse grew and transformed his hoof. We don't know the process of some animals, but it must have occurred, and it will never have undermined their health. But bespectacled man, on the contrary, invents devices outside of his body, and if health and nobility existed in the inventor, they are almost always lacking in the user. iPhone. Devices are bought and sold and stolen, and man becomes increasingly shrewd and weaker. His first devices seem extensions of his arm and couldn't be effective without its strength, but by now the device no longer has any relation to the limb. And it is the device that creates sickness, abandoning the law that was on all earth the creator. The law of the strongest vanished, and we lost healthful selection. we would need much more than psychoanalysis. Under the law established by the possessor of the greatest number of devices, sickness and the sick will flourish. Perhaps through an unheard-of catastrophe produced by devices, we will return to health. When poison gases no longer suffice, an ordinary man in the secrecy of a room in this world will invent an incomparable explosive, compared to which the explosives currently in existence will be considered harmless toys. And another man, also ordinary, but a bit sicker than others, will steal this explosive and will climb up at the center of the earth to set it on the spot where it can have the maximum effect. There will be an enormous explosion that no one will hear, and the earth, once again a nebula, will wander through the heavens, freed of parasites and sickness.
The best part of the book.
Absolutely.
And humanly true. Disturbingly. But it is also, I feel like, incredibly illuminating in terms of the place we are now, right? Where, sorry, this is maybe the wrong, to end on a sort of lunatic riff, but don't you feel as though much of the terrorism, whether it's a guy in a cinema or in Colorado or a bunch of guys in an airport in Brussels, is exactly this. It's exactly this enraged alienation from something, right? That combined with a sense of entitlement and capacity, right? Which is essentially what he's saying modern civilization provides us with, a sense of entitlement and capacity. And then all it takes is being thwarted and pissed off, right? So I will finish by saying this, that I don't know, certainly for me as a reader, the tragicomic is actually the summum, the great art. Beckett, Svevo, Bernhardt, Philip Roth sometimes. The voices that are crying out at the absurdity and darkness, but are doing so aware of the laughable absurdity of it all. At least for me, that's what speaks to, talking about the nearest thing to life. That's what speaks to my experience of life. So I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Thank you for having us.